my whole life I'd been interested in humour and in laughter. I'd always been interested in comedy. I wanted to make comedy when I was young. And then when it came time to do my research, my PhD, I was interested in, I was a scholar of the Middle Ages, I was learning to be a scholar of the Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th centuries. And I was choosing other topics. I was interested in law, bureaucracy, I was interested in politics in different ways. And one day it occurred to me that humour has been the thing that has driven my interest for so long. Maybe I could put the two together, and maybe I could do a study of medieval humour. Really, for me, laughter is one of the most important things there is in communication. I mean, someone did a study, it's every 20 seconds, apparently, in any conversation, there's laughter. It's much more often than we think. We laugh all of the time. And of course, it goes without saying that laughter is doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of communication work, obviously. But really, laughter is doing something else. It's obviously part of power relations. It obviously has a politics attached to it, or it can have a politics attached to it. It articulates who we are. For example, the recent Ukrainian election is a fascinating case study where the candidate who had been a comedian is elected president, right? And what does this say about what laughter and comedy can do as a form of politics? I think he answered a wonderful question. They said, well, what do you have to say about Ukraine's roads? And he said, I have nothing to say because there are no roads. It's a good joke. Does it do something that a more formal answer to that question couldn't do? I think it does. I think in that moment of laughing, we see something terrible, if you like. Donald Trump in the United States, another example where humour can have this, where a clown can become a prince, where a clown can apparently do something more powerful or can speak to people on a level that maybe more rational discourse cannot. I'm not saying it's a good thing at all. I'm just observing that sometimes laughter can be enormously powerful. It's coming to bear. It used to be said that laughter was always conservative. That really what you're doing when you're laughing is you're reducing things back to a common sense. I'm laughing at that. It's ridiculous. It's kind of saying we should go back to something that isn't ridiculous, right? But I think also laughter can sometimes do something much more radical. Laughter can sometimes make us reflect that we are ridiculous, that the human itself is ridiculous, that all attempts to bring order to life, which is what humanity kind of tries to do. We dress up in suits, we pretend we're, reasonable people, but really we're animals underneath, right? Some would say, and that maybe laughter exposes us, reminds us of our inner ridiculousness, that all attempts to bring order and measure and rule to our lives are futile, because really we're laughable animals. Now, my problem with medieval history, as it was, one of my concerns with doing medieval history was that we didn't take account of the humorous moments, the parts where there's deliberately irony or things aren't as they seem. We rely solely on texts. All we know about the 12th and 13th centuries is textual. So I always had this anxiety that we were missing something, that we were missing some layer of irony or humour or those little moments of relief, if you like. Generally speaking, there are three theories of laughter, of why we laugh and what laughter does. The first theory is superiority. It's this idea that we laugh when we come to recognise that we're really superior to something. It's a moment of sudden glory where we recognise that, we've released ourselves from this at least. In other words, every joke, there's a butt of every joke. So you have to be mocking something. Another theory of humour is repression, Freud's theory, the idea that essentially laughter expresses our unspoken, unacknowledged desires, that every joke is like something within us that we want, really, coming up, bubbling up through the surface. And the third theory, the theory that interested me most, is incongruity. This idea, and it comes from Henri Bergson in the late 19th, early 20th century. Bergson's little book, Laughter. And he says that laughter is really something mechanical encrusted on the living. What he means by that is that we laugh in moments when we recognise something artificial, something which is restricting a kind of natural human life. Now, this is silly in a way, obviously, because what is natural human life? But I think there's something in there. I think laughter, drawing attention to artificialities and incongruities, I think that's a really interesting way to think about what laughter is. So, my research is all about really looks at laughter in the 12th century, the 1100s, in Western Europe, but mostly in England and France, looks at laughter as revealing some kind of incongruity in how that state, or these states in England and France are operating. So my interest is in the court of Henry II, English king, between 1154 and 1189. And this is a time when England, and Europe generally, but particularly England, is undergoing this enormous change. Okay, before Henry II was king of England, there was anarchy. All right, it was a time of total chaos. There was a civil war, rule and order, if you like, effectively didn't exist. We had something like bastard feudalism, people gaining what they want by force more than by procedure, right? Henry comes in and he has this idea in 1154 that he's going to restore the law and order that was in his time of his grandfather, right? In reality, Henry really actually begins to innovate these new procedures that had never been there before, written mechanisms for law, for how you get justice, using archives for the first time in a really instrumental way, and a series of other procedures, documentary procedures, the exchequer, formalising the exchequer as a way of processing finances, right? So all of these laws and mechanisms come in to regulate political life. Now this is where laughter comes in, because my theory is that actually laughter becomes a shadow mechanism. Laughter reveals the tension, enormous tension at this kind of imposition of rule, order, procedure onto a previously fairly charismatic, anarchic political order. So the 12th century, what happens in the 12th century? In the 12th century, my argument is that laughter, and my research shows this, laughter becomes suddenly very, very powerful. People start talking about laughter as if it has some kind of enormous power, not just political power, but almost at times supernatural power. So what do I mean by this? Around about the year 1100, before this period, laughter really has diabolical associations, particularly in Christian writing. People don't write about laughter as if it's a good thing. They write about laughter. It kind of weighs upon your soul. The more you laugh, the more damned you are. Because laughter's wicked in their view. Laughter is something, and humour, it's cruel. It's a cruel sport. It doesn't serve a function. Speech makers should not laugh. Kings should not laugh. You should not mock a monarch. Henry I, Henry II's grandfather, when he's mocked, there's a mocking song about him, he has the guy's eyes gouged out. That's the punishment for reckless laughter. In the 12th century, laughter becomes very powerful. This whole thing is overturned. Suddenly it becomes a really positive thing. Monastic and theological writers write about laughter as if it has this spiritual power. If you're having a mystical experience, you're experiencing God's presence within you, you may well laugh. Laugh to express this moment of exhilaration. Rhetoricians talk about the value, the virtue of making people laugh, to not just to sweeten a message of a speech, but also to kind of do some work in them processing the idea, make people laugh, they will understand in a way that they didn't before. Also medical writers start talking about laughter as if it's a good thing. Previously, laughter, it's a sign of an overactive spleen. There might be some disease in your body if you're laughing too much. Maybe you're having a manic attack. By the later 12th century, laughter's a sign of, you've got some good blood, your humour's well balanced. It's a positive sign of health. So that's quite interesting. Politically, what's happening in the 12th century, alongside those intellectual changes in how laughter's viewed, laughter becomes instrumental. It becomes a way of doing politics. So Henry II's courtiers talk more and more about the value of laughter and humour as ways of getting things done. Now, on a practical level, it's fairly cruel. You can bring down your rivals through a well-timed joke. Satire can expose corruption. It can undermine your kind of political enemies. So laughter is really useful in that way. Humour is really useful in that way. But also it does something a lot more. It comes to be valued as kind of a high watermark of your virtue as a courtier. If you can make people laugh in the right way, and if you can laugh yourself in the right way at the right things, then you can kind of show your belonging to the highest echelons of court society. In many ways, it articulates your power. What does this mean? Well, on the one hand, there are these jokes that circulate and these kind of satirical writings, and that kind of like your involvement in these courtiers, Henry's court, who circulate these things, they have this cachet, right? On the other hand, a lot of the humour is itself extremely elite. So you're laughing at Latin puns, you're laughing at the kind of rustic speech of people who don't really fit in the court society. That humour is a kind of way of marking out the boundary. But more than that, really, it's a way of winning favour with the most powerful people. It's a way of winning favour with the king and the king's close familiars. And I suppose there are a couple of examples of that. There are a couple of bishops, a guy called Roger of Worcester, who makes his entire career, like he does all sorts of things that sort of sail too close to the wind. They're a little bit too, they take his power beyond what he should have as a courtier. He's almost acting like a king himself, but he gets away with it because he makes the right joke at the right time and everything is forgiven. The culmination, I would say, of this 12th century power of laughter is with the king himself. And my theory is that in the 12th century we get the birth of this image of this laughing king, a laughing kingship. It's a new kind of kingship. Scholars have looked at this before. They've said, laughing kingship is kind of a mode. But for me, it's really it's a real political mode. It's something that gets something done that could not otherwise be done. It's not just an image of a king's benevolence. The laughing king is someone who does something that the serious king cannot. And what the laughing king does is he manages to absorb the laws, to work with the new governmental laws of bureaucracy and codes, in political society, but also move beyond them. Someone who's able to create a state of exception, which allows procedure to run, but also supersedes it. What do I mean by that? Henry II, as laughing king, is someone who, as I've said, instills a whole range of laws throughout the land. Okay, so there are new mechanisms. You know, if someone invades your land, you now have a right, a legal right, a procedure whereby you, the claimant, can get that land back. Henry II, however, uses laughter as a way to supersede this. So when someone comes to him and says, "My son has dispossessed me of my land. My son is a knight, and he wants my land. You know, and I was off somewhere else, and he's invaded, and now he's inherited before I'm dead." And this was actually legal. It was within the bounds of mechanism under Henry II, but Henry takes sympathy. He says, even though this is the law, he laughs at this. He laughs at this situation. It's so funny that this has happened, that, you know, he's inheriting before you're dead. And he says, well, you know what, we're going to waive the law in this circumstance. And he uses his sovereign authority to make a state of exception and reinstate the claimant's land. This is just the kind of thing that laughter represents. It represents this moment of rupture where the law and procedure are kind of superseded, and the king's sovereign authority appears in its naked form. There are many other examples of this. Another famous example is when Henry II finds two drunks who have been drinking all of the wine in his wine cellar. It's his private collection. He's appalled, right? And these two drunks are brought before him, and apparently they've been slandering his name. They've been slagging off the king as well. And they're asked to explain themselves. Why did you do this? Explain yourselves. And they said, look, we said some terrible things, but it's nothing to what we would have said if you'd let us finish all the wine. And it's a joke, right? And the king laughs. He really laughs. He loves this joke. And he lets them off. Okay, so in the moment that they have managed to use their wit, and in the moment that the king himself has kind of dissolved in laughter, in that moment the law, it's meaningless. Or it's maybe not meaningless. It is suspended. And the sovereign's naked power appears again. So my research really has been about looking at laughter as kind of an index to, on the one hand, tensions in what government and politics are, how they work. And the tension being that rule and law and procedure are fantastic ways of almost running a country or an empire from a distance, you know, of running it almost on autopilot. They work really well, but they produce inequalities and inequities all the time. There are so many cases where normal law and procedure don't seem to quite do true justice. And I believe it's in these moments that laughter is kind of an index. It's kind of a shadow mechanism which comes in. Humour and laughter sort of draws attention to this incongruity between what the law has done and what should have been done. And the laughter sort of, that moment of humour creates a kind of state of exception. It creates this moment of relief and release in which a kind of higher law or justice, a more immediate law or justice, or a more naked sovereignty can work. That's one thing. The other thing really that my research has been looking at is how laughter itself seems to have a power. It seems to be able to express something within the human which is transcendent. It seems to take the human outside of its normal sphere of operation. Laughter seems to represent that moment of ecstatic release. And this really translates into the spiritual sphere. The 12th century also sees, I argue, the emergence of the laughing saint as a motif. This idea that saints, at the moment of high exhilaration, at the moment that a saint is martyred, or at the moment that a saint has a prophetic vision, or a moment that a saint performs a miracle, there's laughter. The laughter that is able to express that ineffable sphere of operation, if you like, or that ineffable power that simple words cannot. But laughter itself can express something divine.